he whispered to me in the gentlest voice. Every alpha has his Luna. And in that moment, I felt like I had the whole world. Chapter 17. Evelyn. My entire body shook. Cold, so cold. Icy water engulfed my vision. My lungs burned in my chest as I gasped for air, only for icy water to stab at my mouth. I wanted to scream for help but couldn't. I shot up in bed, gasping for air. The door of my room was thrown open as Max strode across. I started sobbing uncontrollably as he wrapped his arms around me and held me. To my agent extraordinaire, Myron Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I need air. I clawed at my throat, trying to will myself to breathe as I gasped. Max picked me up before sitting down, with me cradled at his lap. He gently rocked us as I sobbed and gasped. Chevelin. Shit, that's okay. He paused and then moved hair out of my face. Okay, look at me, Evelyn. Look at me. His hand cradling my face. I listened and looked at him despite my erratic heart rate and tear-filled vision. Breathe in with me. Breathe in for seconds through your nose. To my agent extraordinaire, Myron Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He asked, motioning to himself. I shakily nodded, slowly breathing in through my nose with him. Now we are going to hold for 7 seconds. 1, 2. To my agent extraordinaire, Myron Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. 7. He counted as we held our breath. I fought the urge to gasp in air. Now release for 8 seconds through your mouth. Slowly we both exhaled, the shakiness in my throat diminishing. Again. Step by step. He did it with me again. Then a 3rd time. And finally a 4th time. By the end, the desperate need for air had subsided and my mind felt calm and at ease. See, he whispered, arms wrapped tightly around me as he rocked me. You're okay. You're okay. Evelyn. I closed my eyes and rested my head on his chest. Nodding, he continued to rock me back and forth, humming a soft tune that sounded familiar, like a whisper of a memory filling my ears. But as soon as the familiarity had filled me and I searched my mind, he had switched the tune. Okay, Evelyn. I'm going to go now. He began to release me and lay me down. The second he let go, and we lost contact, the warm feeling of energy exchanging flowing between us left and panic filled me. And, no, please don't leave. I gasped, reaching out. Whoa. Shit's okay. Laying beside me and wrapping me into his arms. I won't go anywhere. To my agent extraordinaire, Myron Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I'll be right here, I promise. In the dark room, I nodded my head, feeling safe in the comfort of his strong arms. They caged me and made me feel secure, like my personal fortress of protection. Nodding off to sleep, I couldn't help but think, I love this. I love him. I grinned at the realization. The following morning, Max and I sat down for breakfast. He made eggs and toast, and had conceded to allow me to cut up some fruit after a little arguing. Evelyn, Max began. I looked up at him from my plate of food. I asked him with half smile. I need to talk to you about something serious. My eyebrows furrowed, and I moved my plate to the side, leaning my grey sweater-covered arms onto the table. What is it? I asked, voice revealing my concern. Evelyn, I know you said the other night you didn't want to talk about it. My gaze softened. My smile dropped, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Anxiety bubbled up in my chest, knowing what he would say next. He leaned forward. I'm concerned about you, Evelyn. These nightmares. They're not nightmares. I whispered, looking at the table. What? Gaze full of concern. I looked up at him fully, eyes connecting. They're not nightmares. They're memories. My voice trembled. It is a memory. I let out a strangled sob. Maximus stood up and walked around the table, kneeling in front of me. What is it, sweetie? I had never heard such tenderness and softness in his voice. It was as if the usual roughness had been polished clean, and all that was left was a pure and raw voice extending kindness. I dream of tea that night. Tea, the lake, tea, the tears pelted down my face like a storm. He cut me off, wrapping his arms around me and holding me. Shit's okay. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbert, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He held me in his arms for a few seconds, and I breathed his scent in deeply. Something about the pine and cinnamon that clung to him was comforting. He pulled away slowly, holding my arms and looking at me intently before pushing a piece of hair behind my ear. Do you want me to sleep with you from now on? I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but... I threw my arms around him and clung to him like a child on a tree. Silent tears poured down my face in joy. He just understood me so well. He was so patient with me and so empathetic. My thought from the night before echoed in my mind again. I love him. I love him. I love him. He pulled back and looked at my face, eyes going wide as he looked at me in concern. Did I do something wrong? He exasperated. I laughed and smiled, wiping my tears with my hand. No, not at all. I paused and he looked at me in concern. My eyes softened. You just make me so happy. He grinned and leaned down towards me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He looked at my eyes and then my lips, and then my eyes again. I nodded with a smile, as he pressed his lips against mine. In a harmonious sync, our lips melted against one another, warmth cooling throughout my body as he tightened his hold on me. Our kiss was like a dance, each partner moving in turn. His hands went up to my head, fingers softly intertwining into my hair. We both pulled away breathless and with a smile. You make me happy too, Evelyn. He gazed at me and held my chin. Then, he pressed a kiss to my forehead and wiped my tears. What can we do to make this day good for you? He asked me thoughtfully. Could you show me North Wind? I asked him. He looked at me thoughtfully and nodded whilst holding my hands. I just need you to know something, Evelyn. His voice changed, apprehensive, yes. I slightly concerned by the change in his tone. My pack, my town. I am a leader for them. Like your father. An alpha? I asked, remembering the term my father had used. He nodded. Yes, an alpha. And well, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbert, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My pack, that is. They my past. He ran a hand through his hair. A nervous habit I noticed he had. There's a lot of assumptions the people that live here have made about me, about the person I am outside of ruling. If you have questions, please ask me. Just don't run away if you hear things that unsettle you from them. Hear me out first. Please. I stared at him in confusion, brows narrowing. How could anyone think of Maximus as anything but sweet and gentle? I knew he had a tendency for strong language and authoritative tone, but he was a leader. That was part of the job. What do you mean? What happened in your past? I asked him, leaning forward on my chair. It's hard for me to talk about. I know I said a lot, but I don't want to burden you more right now with the stress you're under. I promise I'll tell you later. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilbert, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He asked me with sincerity. He seemed to search my eyes with apprehension at my reaction. Gazing into his eyes, I smiled and nodded. Maximus had my full trust. I had only known him for a little over a month, and still, he made me feel safe. He made me feel protected. He made me feel cherished. Whatever had happened in the past, I knew Maximus would explain it all to me. Standing up, I told Maximus I was going to get ready and run upstairs. I threw on a white long-sleeve shirt, jeans, black boots, and a brown wool trench coat as well as a white beanie. I did my makeup and brushed my teeth. A few minutes later, I was downstairs and ready to go. I heard Maximus call behind me. I turned around and smiled. Yes. My eyes widened slightly as I took in his appearance. He had shaved, his sharp jaw ever more evident. He wore a navy knit layered on top of a white shirt. With jeans, the shirt fitted to perfection, highlighting his sculpted arms. I heard him chuckle and I blushed, staring at the ground, realizing that he had caught me checking him out. He stepped forward, changing the subject to help me avoid embarrassment. "Let's get going then." I looked up and nodded, following him out the door, cheeks still burning. We climbed into his silver Audi RS, the plush interior enveloping me. I hadn't noticed the first time I had climbed into the car how nice it was. The stress of leaving home had probably absorbed all my focus. However, being in the car for a second time, I realized how fancy it was. I sunk into the seats and admired the dashboard. Maximus got in, closing the door and buckling his seat belt. I turned to him and smiled. "So where are we going?" A sly grin spread across his face, and I felt butterflies in my stomach as he pulled out of the driveway. "You'll see." I lowered my head to the side and gave him a blank look. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelbe, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I asked in a sarcastic tone. "You're not going to tell me?" He grinned and shook his head. "Nope." He popped the P. I jokingly huffed and leaned back in my seat, crossing my arms and watching our terrain. We left the dirt road that Maximus has occupied and turned onto a paved one. Little by little houses came into view, sprinkled throughout the trees. I remembered how Maximus had told me weeks before that the homes were much more spread out than in Ice Valley, and it was incredibly apparent. However, a few streets later, we came to a road where houses, albeit spread out, were not shielded from view by the forest. It was a sea of log cabins spread throughout the snow-topped forest. Turning once more, I gasped. I knew we were in the mountains, but I hadn't expected the town to look as it did. Beautiful wooden buildings were built into the mountainside, densely packed together in contrast to the spread-out homes. It was stunning. "Wow," I breathed. Maximus half smiled and looked up at the town as we drove up the mountain. "Yeah, it's pretty nice." I nodded, looking and seeing a surprising multitude of people. Werewolves, friends, couples, and teens walked up and down the mountain, a few children running around beside them, a collection of people that appeared to be out of a fairy tale. We were halfway up the mountain when Maximus turned into a flattened parking lot, a small wooden building behind us. "Is this it?" Looking through Maximus' foggy window at the building. "Yes," he smiled, turning the car off and opening his car door. Hugging my coat tighter as a cool gust of wind blew snow into my face. It certainly wasn't cold night wind without reason. Maximus, who had been standing slightly in front of me, paused and stepped back, wrapping an arm around me and rubbing it on down my shoulder as we walked. I leaned my head against his shoulder and smiled. His attention to detail was evident even with the smallest of gestures. Walking around the building, a wooden sign hanging at the door made me pause and smile wider. "Harriet's Cafe and Bookstore," the sign read. I grinned up at Maximus, pecking his cheek before pulling away and quickly going towards the door. He followed behind me, chuckling. I felt it instantly as I entered the warm atmosphere. A fireplace stood in the corner of the cafe, pumping out releasing hot air. All around me was a myriad of books, covers old and new, small black circular tables crammed against the walls, and to my right, a large coffee bar made of a rich brown wood stood. Behind it, a calcboard listed out an assortment of warm and delectable drinks to choose from. I was so enraptured in the place that I failed to notice the fact the bookstore had gone silent, eyes staring widely, standing frozen in place. I was broken from my reverie when Maximus made a noise in his throat, almost like a subdued grunt. I turned to him, noticing the tense expression on his face. Then, I looked around and noticed that people in the store had begun bowing their heads. Eyes pointed to the ground. I turned around the back to Maximus, shooting him a look of confusion. He cleared his throat and stared out at the group of people. "You may rise." His voice was deep and velvety, similar to when he had first met my father. There was a richness to it that commanded power and respect. It was different from the light tone he used with me. His tone then carried weight, like a pungent odor. I looked at him with a brow raised and he shook his head. "Come on," taking my hand and leading me to the counter. A young woman with curly auburn hair and brown eyes wore a black apron and a white long-sleeve shirt, and stood behind the bar. She looked up at us and I couldn't help but notice the way she shook. It certainly wasn't from being cold, as the place was not only pumped full of warm air from the fireplace but what I suspected was a heater. She looked at me for a moment, eyes wide and looking baffled, before Maximus cleared his throat. "Oh, eight," she stumbled, painting on a smile. I noticed the way she avoided Maximus' gaze but would glance at mine. "How can I help you? You guys, I mean." I smiled warmly and giggled in an attempt to ease the tension. "Hi," I said in the sweetest voice I could muster. I watched as her shoulders dropped slightly. I looked up at the chalkboard, noting the fact they had eggnog. Eggnog after Christmas? I asked her with a brow raised. She looked slightly alarmed but scratched her neck. "Oh, it's kind of a specialty around here." "A speciality? Is it good?" She smiled and nodded. "One of my favorites." "Perfect. Could I please get one?" She smiled and nodded, grabbing a cup and a pen. "Oh, and what name is that for?" "Evel, Luna Alexander." Maximus cut me off. A collection of gasps rang out in the bookshop as people looked at me, even more bewildered than when I had walked in. When I made eye contact with them, they looked down immediately. I turned to Maximus, looking at him in confusion. "Max," I began, cut off by more sharp intakes of breath. What was wrong with these people? "Why did you say Luna Alexander?" "My name is Evel, and silly." I teased him. His eyes got slightly darker. His pupils dilated as he leaned closer to me and whispered in my ear. "Every alpha has a Luna." He pulled back and I released an O, remembering Connor calling my mother Luna Smith at the dinner table. I figured it must be a term for an alpha's mate. Suddenly, I felt embarrassed by the people's stares, realizing they now knew what I was to Maximus. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I still wasn't entirely sure what that entailed. I noticed the barista now shaking, avoiding eye contact with me as well. My apologies," she stumbled. I tried to relieve the tension with a smile, but it couldn't be helped. Nothing I could do seemed to ease the tension in the shop. Maximus ordered his drink and stood by the coffee bar waiting for our orders. "Why don't you look for a book?" "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He turned to me and asked. I glanced behind me to my left, noticing the two girls whispering at a table and glancing in my direction. Deciding to ignore the stares, and nodded with a half smile. "I'll be right back," I spoke lowly, although I knew with their wolf hearing. The whole store probably heard me, walking down to aisles of books. The store's size seemed to grow more apparent. I walked past non-fiction, sci-fi. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Even a Christian book section, before finding myself stumbling upon the children's section. My heart ached as I looked at it, missing my kids back home in Ice Valley. I felt a tug at my jacket and gasped. A little boy jumped back from me at my gasp. I widened my eyes. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you," I whispered. Maximus came running around the corner, two drinks in his hands. "Is everything okay?" Anxiously looking me up and down. I nodded and touched his face lightly. "Everything's fine, Max. This little boy just startled me, that's all." Maximus looked down at the little boy, his hardened gaze and posture softening. "Oh," he spoke with a soft smile. "I'm sorry I see aid you." The little boy apologized, eyes cast to the ground. Just like everyone in there, the boy couldn't make eye contact with me. I knelt down so I was eyes level with him, gently lifting the little boy's chin, directing his gaze into my eyes. "That's all right, sweetheart. Did you need something?" I asked him gently. I don't know if I should ask, he said, looking towards the ground again. Oh, you can ask me anything. I smiled down at him. I don't bite, I promise. I winked. Well, I heard LPPALs and say you were his Luna. Is that TWW? He asked me in a cute high voice. I laughed and glanced up at Maximus, who gave me a nod and a soft smile. Yeah, that is true. Okay. Turning around. What's your name? Sweetie. I asked him. He turned around and shot me a smile. I'm Beatty. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Trying to stifle my smile at the sweet boy's pronunciation. None. He nodded. Well, it's very nice to meet you. Brady. He beamed at me. Nice to meet you, TWW. He looked over his shoulder. Mommy might want me. I looked over his head. Towards the corner of the store he was looking. Why don't you head over to her? I'll see you around. He waved back at me, skipping around the corner towards his mother. I stood up, a sense of elation filling me at my contentedness. Maybe I could read to the children here in Northwind too. I turned to Maximus and he grinned down at me. What? I asked him with a laugh. You're just so amazing with kids. He spoke softly, eyes twinkling in the soft bookstore light. Something in them seemed to share a hint of the future we had in store. I blushed looking down. Well, thank you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nogan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Handing me my cup. I smiled and took it from him. Yes, please. We walked over to a table to sit down. I took off my jacket and placed it on the chair. Max put his coffee down at the table. Just as I was sitting down, Maximus' phone rang. Yes, he asked, picking up the call. I watched his expression grow dark as he cursed under his breath. I'll be right there, he said, hanging up the phone. The dark look on his face light, and as his eyes softened, looking at me. Evelyn, I'm so sorry, but something has come up at the pack house. I need to go. Okay, I said, standing up. Wait. Holding a hand out. Why don't you stay? What? He scratched his head. Why don't you stay and enjoy your drink and pick out some books for the house? I wanted you to have a day to take your mind off. And you'll blaze through the books in a few days anyway, won't you? I breathed out a laugh. I guess that's true. My face grew serious and I scrunched my brows in concern. Are you sure I shouldn't go with you? He shook his head. No. Stay here and enjoy. If you need anything at all, give me a call, okay? I nodded with a smile as he kissed my forehead. Then, he grabbed his coffee off the table and exited in a hurry, door flying open with a gust of cold wind and snow, before slamming shut. Sitting at the table, I awkwardly sipped my eggnog, noticing the silence around me. Even though I wasn't looking around, I felt eyes on me. After a few minutes of quiet, I decided I couldn't stand sitting alone. I stood up and walked towards the rows of shelves, searching through the books. After minutes of combing through, I had found a few books but was having a hard time deciding on one. I glanced up, searching for help, only to notice the barista from earlier standing in the book section staring at me. The moment I caught her eyes, she spun around, pretending she hadn't been watching me. I stifled a grin. My brain waged a war with itself over asking for help, but a few moments later I decided it couldn't be helped. I cleared my throat. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nobel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. I asked, stepping forward away from the books. The curly-headed girl spun around and looked to her left and right before pointing at herself me. She squeaked. Yes. I replied nervously. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear with my free hand. Would you mind helping me choose a book? I noticed the way the girl's green eyes brightened slightly. Yes, I'd love to help. She smiled. She walked over and looked at my arrangement. Wow, you have great taste, she exclaimed before looking away from me nervously. Oh, I looked at my shoes. Thank you. She picked up 2 books and turned her head to the side, before turning and looking at me. Are you more of an action or romance book kind of girl? I laughed. Romance for sure. My kind of girl. She wiggled her brows and I laughed. Without a word, she handed me one of the books which had a blue cover with a heart made of ice. This is definitely your story. She smiled lightly. Her posture seemed to have relaxed immensely from our earlier interaction. Thank you so much, I exclaimed. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She half smiled, turning around to walk away. Oh, I'm sorry. Would you mind telling me your name? I asked her. Oh, she turned around, her hands laced behind her back. I'm Maggie. I reached out a hand. I'm Evelyn. She looked at my hand nervously. I don't know if I should hold your hand, she remarked nervously. She tried to laugh but seemed uncomfortable. Is it because I'm human? I asked with scrunched brows. She seemed surprised. You know. Well, of course you would know you are. Sorry, she stumbled. I laughed. No, it's okay. I'm sure humans don't come here very often. No, they don't. She softly spoke, eyes drifting towards the ground. So it's because I'm human? I asked her lightly. She looked up slightly alarmed. Oh no, it's not that. She couldn't complete her sentence as she frowned trying to complete the sentence so. I trailed off, slowly removing my dangling hand. I'm sorry I didn't mean to bother you. I just moved here so I thought. Never mind. No, she shook her hands frantically and stepped forward. I'm sorry I didn't mean to be rude. I would love to get to know you. It's just she leaned in and whispered. You are Alpha Alexander's mate, right? I am. My brows crunched together. Oh, I'm sorry you probably think I'm so weird it's just. I didn't think he'd appreciate me fraternizing with you. I'm a low-ranking pack member. I laughed and she looked at me like I was insane. Max? I asked with a giggle. I'm sure Max doesn't mind who I make friends with. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She asked in genuine surprise. I tilted my head. Of course not. Why would he? Well, do you want more eggnog? She asked me, lightly changing the subject. It threw me off but ignored it. Sure. Maggie and I talked for hours. It turned out we had many common interests. We both loved books and coffee, and we also both loved Gilmore Girls. I laughed at a joke Maggie made, a sense of contented mess filling me at making a new friend. Maggie's laughter died down and she looked at me a bit more seriously, leaning forward. Evelyn, could I ask you a question? Oh, of course, I exclaimed, sipping my eggnog. She looked down at her coffee for a moment thoughtfully. Alpha Alexander. He's not. Never mind, she shook her head. I leaned forward. Not what? Not controlling. I mean, she looked around us and leaned in to whisper. He really let you call him Max. The smile that had been on my face began to drop as a sense of dread and concern filled me. Still, I laughed it off. No. I shook my head. No, he is not controlling at all. Maximus is sweet and gentle and kind and loving. And yes, he does let me call him that. I leaned away from her, a sense of unease building in my stomach. Maximus had warned me, hadn't he? But I hadn't expected this. The question might have been light, caught to an extent. But nonetheless, it spoke of a mistrust that lay in his community. Oh no, I've made you uncomfortable, I'm so sorry. She bit her nails and looked at me with concern. No, it's fine. I shook my head and held my temple. Why did you ask? Yeah, it's not important. She shook her head. No, Maggie. Whatever it is you have to say it. I nodded, encouraging her. She looked around in concern. The coffee shop had mostly emptied by now, only a customer or two lingering in the back aisles. She leaned forward. Most people think Maximus is To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. No one expected him to have a mate, that's all. And you're so. Suolo. I asked her, breathing out a laugh. So sweet, she said with a sense of bewilderment. I sat back in confusion. Maximus was one of the sweetest people I knew. He was tender and affectionate and kind. This was a person I loved. Why do you think he's cursed? I asked, tilting my head. Maggie, who was already pale, turned the color of a ghost as the blood drained from her face. Her face looked hollow and sunken and her eyes widened. Why, you don't know. She trembled. Oh, goddess, I've screwed up. What don't I know? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I leaned forward, grabbing her shaking hands. I can't. Maggie, I spoke, my tone wary. I took a deep breath in. Tell me. My voice came out almost as a command, something strange to its tone. As if a sense of regal ity had washed over me, as if I had sung an elusive melody that forced listeners to hold my attention. A glazed look crossed Maggie's features. Alpha Alexander's mother died giving birth to him. His younger brother was found murdered in a forest. The Alpha S soaked in blood. Maggie had tears build up in her eyes and she looked as if she was trying to stop herself but couldn't. Oh, beat was our Roguesby, but no set was found. And then his stepmother was found. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Murdered by him. The trance broke and Maggie sobbed into her hands. I am sorry, I shouldn't have told you that, but your voice it. I reached out to apologize and touch her shoulder. Before I could, she got up from the table at lightning speed and fled from me. My own form began to tremble as I sat wide-eyed. I took in sharp breaths. My Max couldn't do that. No, he couldn't. Yet, a small part of me wondered if it could be true. I began to shake violently. My mind raced as my heart pounded in my chest, questioning everything. It seemed like time froze in place, and I was stuck in a fear-laced trance, my mind somewhere entirely else. I didn't hear the door swing open behind me, boots crunching on the snow that was beneath them as they entered. I didn't feel the gust of cold wind biting at my face. I didn't even hear my name called. It was only when calloused hands touched my shoulder ever so gently, an angel's feather of a touch, that I jumped in my seat wide-eyed. I turned around, knowing exactly who I'd find. Maximus. I shook, tears in my eyes, as I met his concerned ice blue ones. We need to talk. Chapter 18. Maximus. I drove up the mountain, excitement coursing through my veins. I had a feeling Evelyn was going to love the place I was taking her. Seeing a familiar wooden building, I pulled aside and I parked in the parking lot behind Harriet's. Is this it? Evelyn asked me, looks across from me through my foggy window and at the building. Yes, turning the car off and opening my door. Evelyn hopped out of the car and followed. A gust of wind brushed against my face, and a smile made its way to my lips as I remembered where our town had received its name. I turned around and looked at Evelyn when I heard a small sound escape her lips which sounded like Brits. Looking at her, I noticed the way she was holding her arms, and I stepped back, wrapping an arm around her. Then, I rubbed up and down her shoulder at a fast pace as we walked around the corner. Hoping the action would warm her slightly, she leaned her head against my shoulder, and I grinned from ear to ear at the contact. Holding her close to me warmed my soul. There was something about having her near me that made me feel stronger, like I had something worth being strong for. When we came to the front of the building, Evelyn paused and smiled. Her smile is brilliant. She turned to me and grinned even wider, before pecking my cheek. In hurried steps, she quickly went towards the door. I followed behind her, chuckling to myself at the precious action. If it weren't for the cold biting my cheeks, the small blush that painted them might have been evident to her. As I entered the all-too-familiar store, I felt warmth pour over me. Evelyn's brown hair flicked from side as she took in the bookshop and cafe. A large fireplace stood in the corner of the cafe, releasing warm air. Books, old and new, lined the shelves. Small black circular tables crammed against the walls, and a large coffee bar made of a local brown wood stood. It was serene, exactly why I had brought her. I had come a few times prior late at night when no one else was present so that I could soak up the atmosphere. However, it was midday, and the small shop was packed with pack members. I felt myself grow rigid as I felt their stares. Rolling my shoulders back, I looked for their gaze with intensity. I wasn't unwelcome to stares, but I was to theirs. Their stares reeked of judgment and fear, and I snarled at the moment we walked through the door. Evelyn turned around, looking at me with confusion. Turning around again, she looked towards people in the store who had begun bowing their heads. Eyes pointed to the ground. It was a sign of respect in many packs. It was something I was used to, but watching Evelyn's body tense, I knew it was strange to her. She turned to me, the confusion only more evident on her face by the scrunched expression it held. I cleared my throat and stared out at the group of people. "You may rise," I commanded in my alpha voice. I watched as the people slowly looked up, eyes still averted from me. I was used to it, but still, every time I saw people's fear its tongue. It was why I avoided leaving my home except for pack work. No one I ruled trusted me except a select few. I looked at Evelyn, who raised a brow at me. I simply shook my head at her, not wanting to explain. "Come on," I whispered, taking her hand and guiding her to the counter. If I hadn't known who the young girl at the counter was, her curly red hair would have let me know immediately she was a member of the Travis family. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madame Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patient enthusiasm." I thought to myself, questioning if I had properly recalled her name. Glancing at her name tag, I confirmed. I tried to make an effort to know my pack members' names, even if they didn't care to know me. She looked up at us and I immediately noticed the way she shook. I concealed it, but the movement made me uncomfortable and angry. It was simply another pack member fearful of me based on stories and half-truths. It seemed that my time with Evelyn had allowed me a momentary escape from it. But standing there, I was only reminded that my pack members, the fear of me was very real. I noticed her brown eyes dart to look at Evelyn, eyes wide and looking baffled. I knew when I had left the house with Evelyn that I would have to confront the truth with my pack members. I had not made a formal announcement about my mate, but after today the word would spread quickly. I cleared my throat, hoping to cast a questioning gaze away from my mate. "Oh, hey. She stumbled, painting on a smile. She avoided my gaze but glanced at Evelyn. "How can I help you? You guys. I mean..." My sweet mate smiled warmly and giggled in a clear attempt to ease the tension. A comforting figure seemed to emerge from her as she said, "Hi," in the softest, most delicate voice I had ever heard come from her lips. It was so genuine and endearing it took everything in me not to swoop her up in my arms and capture her lips. Her entire being screamed of the motherly instinct innate to Aluna. Maggie seemed to relax slightly, the strength of Aluna's voice already offering her ease. "Eggnog after Christmas?" Evelyn asked her with a brow raised. Maggie's eyes wide and as she tensed in alarm, she scratched her neck. "Oh, it's kind of a specialty around here." "A speciality? Is it good?" Evelyn asked gently. She smiled and nodded. "One of my favorites." "Perfect." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Could I please get one?" Even in the midst of a clear power dynamic, Evelyn still amazed me with the etiquette and politeness she held towards others. Her tactics worked in easing tension as Maggie smiled and nodded, grabbing a cup and a pen. "Oh, and what name is that for?" Looking up at my mate. Luna Alexander." I cut her off. I would not have my mate mistaken for anything less than she was to me. A collection of gasps rang out in the bookshop as people looked at Evelyn with wide faces. When she looked at them, they looked down immediately. Next, she turned to ask me a question. She was cut off as everyone took in a sharp breath. Irritation at their reaction filled me, but I had to hold a grain of understanding. No one had called me Maximus, let alone Max since Charlie. But Evelyn didn't know that. To the people of Nightwind, though, they could only assume the worst. I smelled the fear rolling off of them as they clearly worried I might lash out at my own mate. I was furious by the insult of it all. The fact they could think I would grow angry with my own sweet mate, the woman I held to be the most precious thing to me in the entire world. I reeled in my anger as Evelyn looked at me with a teasing smile, cooling the furnace in my soul. Why did you say? Luna Alexander. My name is Evelyn Silly. She shook her head and laughed. Desire hit me like a ton of brick, and I felt my pupils dilate. Leaning in, I brushed my lips against her ear and whispered, "Every alpha has a Luna." She shivered, and whispered no. As I masked a triumphant grin, the previously calmed barista was now shaking again, avoiding eye contact with the both of us. My apologies," she stumbled. Evelyn attempted to calm the tension again with a smile, but now even she couldn't manage to remove it. I ordered a black coffee and stood with Evelyn by the coffee bar waiting for our orders. I sensed Evelyn's discomfort from the strange stares of the people around us and their hushed whispering. I turned to her and whispered, "Why don't you look for a book? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I hoped the physical separation from me, while it pained me, might help remove tension. I heard Evelyn audibly sigh, in response before nodding with a half-smile. The trip had become much more stressful than intended, and I mentally scolded myself for taking her out when we could have been happily snuggled up on the couch at home away from the judgment of others. "I'll be right back," she whispered to me. She walked around the corner down and I love books and I turned back towards the coffee bar. The barista was evidently nervous as she spilled hot espresso on her hands and then muttered apologies for gasping. Deciding to avert my gaze, I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. Looking down, I saw missed messages from Gamma's Xerxes. Gamma's Xerxes 10:30 am, disruption at northern border. Gamma's Xerxes 10:45 am, update, potential rogues. I felt apprehension tug in my chest as I read that. Rogues were usually easily handled, but after a multitude of recent rogue attacks at our northern border, I felt nervous. Gamma's Xerxes 11 am, update, dead border patrol found. I glanced at the current time. It was 11:30, and I hadn't received any more updates from him. I shot him a quick text, asking for an update as Maggie placed the drinks on the counter and then whispered, "For you, Alpha," tucking my phone into my pocket. I thanked her and grabbed the drinks all. I heard come from around the corner. It was Evelyn. Without a thought, I took off running through the store, down the aisle towards her, not caring about the hot drinks in my hands that threatened to spill. "Is everything okay?" I asked as I rounded the corner. I looked Evelyn up and down for any sign of injury but found none. She stepped forward with a gentle smile and lightly touched my jaw. "Everything's fine, Max. This little boy just startled me, that's all." She motioned behind her. My posture relaxed as a little boy that must have been around 3 years old came into view. "Oh," I spoke with a soft smile. "I'm sorry I SCA you." The little boy apologized, eyes cast to the ground. Evelyn knelt down before gently lifting the little boy's chin, directing his gaze into her eyes. "That's all right, sweetheart. Did you need something?" she asked him tenderly. Her motherly nature oozed off her in waves. I don't know if I should ask," he said, looking towards the ground again. "Oh, you can ask me anything," she exclaimed with a wide smile. "I don't bite, I promise." She winked. "Well, I heard all PPALs and say you were his Luna. Is that TWW?" I stifled my chuckle at his pronunciation. Evelyn laughed and glanced at me for confirmation, and I nodded with a smile. "Yeah, that is true," she told him. "Okay." Turning away from her. "What's your name?" "Sweetie," she called to him. He turned around and gave her a baby-toothed smile. "I'm Beatty. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm, putting her hand to her mouth as she tried to hide a smile. None. He nodded. Well, it's very nice to meet you, Brady. She beamed at him. He smiled wider. Nice to meet you, TWW. He looked over his shoulder, towards a corner of the store. Mummy might want me. Evelyn followed his gaze. Why don't you head over to her? I'll see you around. She waved at the boy. He waved back, skipping around the corner towards his mother. Watching her brief interaction with the boy, I couldn't help but think, she will be an amazing mother. I grinned like a child with a prize at the thought. What? She laughed at my expression. You are just so amazing with Kit. I spoke from the heart, hoping she would somehow read the desires of my heart through a smile. She blushed and looked down at the floor. Well, thank you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilgan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Handing her cup, she smiled and took it from me. Yes, please. We walked over to a small black table that sat by the front window and door. Evelyn removed her jacket and placed it on a chair. Placing my coffee on the table, Evelyn sat down as my phone rang. I glanced down at the screen and saw it was Xerxes. Yes, I asked, picking up the call. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It's confirmed. Xerxes began. I had a sense of fatigue unusual for him in his voice. Alpha, they are coming in waves. There is dozens of them. We are doing our best. But we need your help. My chest tight, and as I glanced toward Evelyn, an overwhelming need to keep her and my pack safe filled me. I'll be right there, I told him before hanging up the phone. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I apologized, but something has come up at the pack house. I need to go. Okay, she said, standing up. Wait. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Holding a hand out. I didn't want to alarm her, so I took a deep breath and calmly asked her, Why don't you stay? What? She asked in confusion. I scratched my head, trying to come up with a half-decent excuse. Why don't you stay and enjoy your drink and pick out some books for the house? I wanted you to have a day to take your mind off. And you'll blaze through the books in a few days anyway, won't you? I asked her. She breathed out a laugh, much to my relief. I guess that's true. She shrugged. She looked to the floor, a look of concern painting her face. For a moment, I feared the mate bond had somehow shared a shred of my worry with her as she asked me intently, Are you sure I shouldn't go with you? I shook his head. No. Stay here and enjoy. If you need anything at all, give me a call, okay? She nodded with a smile, and I pressed a kiss to her forehead. A silent promise I would come back. Rogues were not something to be taken lightly, but especially an attack of this scale. I grabbed my coffee off the table and exited in a hurry, the door flying open and slamming shut behind me. Sprinting to my car, I hopped in and sped away from Harriet's. When I was 10 miles out from the north border, I hopped out of my car, stripping my clothes and shifting into my wolf, at an unimaginable speed. My bones cracked and reshaped, my body making way for black fur. I shook myself, and then took off through the forest, dirt digging beneath my claws. As I neared the border, the metallic smell of blood filled my nose, and I growled. I heard barking and the sound of snapping. Coming to a halt, I took in the scene before me. A multitude of wolves from my pack were fighting off scruffy-looking rogues. The rogues were distinct with their matted fur, small stature, and red eyes. But more than that, they each had a distinct goal kill. They were out for blood. I looked through the crowd, pinpointing who I assumed must be their leader. A grey she-wolf slightly larger than the rest, with a white streak of fur running along her side. Then, I pinpointed Xerxes. He was a black wolf with a silver underbelly, and I watched as a small wolf bit into his shoulder. He snarled and easily disposed of them. More charged at him, and I pounced into action, snapping wolf after wolf's neck in my teeth. Xerxes and I stood tail to tail, tearing through vicious rogue after rogue. In a matter of minutes, Xerxes and I stood in a snowy field covered in blood, with every wolf that had helped from my pack equally covered. Seeing one remaining rogue, the leader, I stalked towards her and she snapped her teeth at me, releasing a ferocious growl. I growled back, but as an alpha mine was fiercer, I stalked towards her growling, trying to force her into submission. An alpha's growl could make even the strongest wolf kneel, but rogues were unpredictable. I barked at her, commanding her to shift, but she shook her head, her piercing almond eyes threatening a challenge. She continued to refuse. And so finally, I shifted. Shift, I barked out in my alpha voice. Weakly, the she-wolf whimpered, bowing her head and shifting. It was an older woman, maybe 50 years of age, and her hair was silver with a white streak. I kneeled down and took her chin in my hand and yanked her forward. "What are you doing on my land?" I spat out at her. She glared at the floor. I elongated my nails, allowing the tips to ever to slightly sink into her skin. Not enough to bleed, but enough to hurt. "I'm not going to ask again," I glared. "So, tell me why the fuck you are trespassing and attacking my pack." A singular tear went down the she-wolf face as she met my gaze, a hardened and stoic expression across her face. "Where are the children?" she asked me. The question took me off guard, and I retracted my claws, standing and stepping back from her. I stood silent, arms crossed, glaring at her. She stood, and I heard Caleb, Xerxes, growl behind me along with my delta. Matthias White. I raised a hand to silence them. "I asked you a question, you alpha scum." She spat on the ground. Her eyes began to grow red, a sign of her losing control to her wolf. Rogues could only last so long without a pack. The longer without, the more feral and unpredictable they became. I stepped forward. The terrified children that came into our care, malnourished. I stepped forward. Uncared for. I stepped forward and she growled, "I'm loved. Lies, you piece of sh." She charged at me and I caught her by the neck, stopping her. I wagged my finger. I wasn't finished. She glared. "The children are safe and happy." I spoke with malice. It was true. The children had been well cared for by my pack, but I felt contempt at the wolves' accusatory nature, considering that everything I said about the children's state when I found them was true. I found it all the more contemptuous. Suddenly, the she-wolf I held sniffed the air, and her eyes widened. "You bastard," she shouted, arms swinging at me as her claws elongated. "What did you do to her? What did you do? Where is she?" She screamed. Her nails scratched down my arm, leaving a trail of blood, and I dropped her on the snow as she tried to come at me. "Where is she?" She screamed again, trying to continue her assault. My men stepped in, grabbing her by the arms and restraining her as I looked at my arm in shock. I was rarely injured, let alone by psychotic rogues. Xerxes, who had put parts on, pulled out a wolfbane concoction from his pocket, injecting it in her neck. Even as she faded into sleep, she continued to scream about some girl. Watching her body go limp, I felt myself grow deeply disturbed by the outburst. One moment she was asking about the children, the next she was screaming about some girl. Albeit, one of the children we had rescued was a young girl, but I hadn't harmed her. I hadn't even met the little girl. Watching Caleb and Matthias place the woman into a black van to escort her to the cells, I decided I would visit the girl tomorrow and try to find answers. I wanted to know who this woman was and why she and the other rogues were hellbent on invading and killing my people. I walked up behind Caleb as he closed the doors of the van. "Xerxes, any idea how this whim infiltrated our land or who she is?" I asked him. "They killed 2 wolves who were on parole. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." They appeared to have memorized our shift patterns and infiltrated. As for the women, he glanced back at the van. "I've never seen her in my life." I nodded my head thoughtfully, resting a hand on my chin. double the border patrol guards, and have the shifts on a random weekly rotation starting Monday. Until this is figured out, no one is to be out past 11 p.m. Are we clear? He nodded and bowed. Yes, Alpha. We are clear. I nodded, watching as he and my Delta drove away. Sighing, I walked back to my car and put my clothes on, holding up my sweater. I cursed under my breath, realizing my arm was covered in blood which would stain my sweater. Shaking my head, I decided I'd stick to my shirt and pants and simply explain the blood to Evelyn when I came to get her. I was anxious to get her after what had just happened, a fear that had already been building for her safety, only amplified by the day's events. My mind swarmed with questions, but I found no answers. I had never seen the women before, and I wasn't sure how she and the children were connected. All I knew was that we had a rogue issue on our hands, and that only meant one thing: danger. Pulling up to Harriet's, I hurried out of the car and flung the cafe's door open. Evelyn, I called to her with a smile, seeing her back turned to me. My eyebrows narrowed when she didn't respond. Stepping forward, I noticed her entire form shaking, and listening closely, I heard the raggedness of her breath and her erratic heartbeat. The drowning of panic flooded my chest, and I felt like I couldn't get an air. Evelyn, I breathed, lightly touching her shoulder. She jumped, a sharp intake of breath passing from her lips as she turned to look at me wide-eyed. I felt a sense of alarm as I took in her ghost-like appearance. All the blood had drained from her face, and her eyes were reddened full of tears, downcast towards the floor. Before I could even say anything, she spoke just above a whisper. Maximus. She shook. She looked up, honey eyes meeting my own. We need to talk. Okay, I whispered. I moved closer to her slowly, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. What's going on? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Her eyes widened again and her breathing grew shallow. She stuttered. I followed her gaze and realized the hand I had touched her shoulder with was attached to my arm, which was covered in blood. Blood, she whispered, sounding faint. She gasped a few times before I watched her eyes roll back. Her head fell backward, and I quickly caught it, along with her body, and picked her up. I pushed the hair out of her face and looked down at her, still being in growing concern. Looking around the cafe, I found it eerily empty. I listened closely, only to hear a faint sniffling. The salty smell of tears that were not my mate's filled my nose. Stepping forward with Evelyn in my arms, I walked through a row of books towards the back. A black door that read, "Employees only," stood there, and I grabbed the handle only to realize it was locked. I knocked on the door. A shriek echoed out, followed by muffled sobs. Maggie, open the door, I commanded. Please. I didn't mean she stumbled as she unlocked the door. As soon as it was open, she fell backwards, cowering in fear and sobbing. She hugged her knees to her chest, her face buried in them. I didn't, forgive me. Oh, I'm sorry. I took a deep breath in, not wanting to scare the young women anymore, and certainly not wanting to wake my mate. Maggie, I spoke calmly. Tell me what happened. Her lips quivered as she spoke. Evelyn asked me what H happened. WYW? We all say why, what I owe you? She trembled too much to finish the sentence. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I gritted out, doing my best not to growl. She nodded shakily. What did you say to her? Glaring. I wasn't going to say anything. I swear, BB, but you SEDTH is voice L, like you're a alpha voice, and I couldn't stop N myself. Her voice cracked. I tried T to S, stop IS, swear. I raised a hand to silence her and looked down at my unconscious mate with burning questions. It was unheard of for a mated Luna to use an alpha voice, let alone an unmated human. Knowing I needed to focus on the questions Evelyn would be asking, rather than the questions I had for her. Thank you. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelgan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. That will be all, I told her with a nod of my head. I heard Hardly breathe out shakily, in a sense of relief and horror all in the same breath. Turning towards the door, I walked out with Evelyn tucked in my arms, and then out of the cafe, placing her in the car. I buckled her into her seat before pressing a kiss to her forehead. I felt a gnawing fear building in my gut. Fear I'd never kiss or touch her again. Fear I would lose her forever. I knew my past would come to light eventually, but I hadn't expected it to so soon. So soon. And not on my own terms. Sighing, I closed her car door and walked around the car to get in on my side, driving us home. Laying in my bed, I wrapped my arms tightly around Evelyn, hearing her steady breaths. My head laying on her chest, I listened to her heartbeat, reassuring myself she was there. The day's events had rattled me, and I knew once she woke up I would have another battle to fight. I was so terrified of losing her. She had become my entire world. If she would hear me out, I would tell her not only everything about me, but everything she meant to me. I was startled by a sharp intake of breath. Sitting up, arms on either side of Evelyn, I pulled back and watched as her eyes fluttered open. "Max," she whispered, eyes softening. "Hi, sweetheart." Brushing a piece of hair behind her ear. I need to talk to you," she said in a serious tone, sitting up. Despite the gravity of our circumstances, I couldn't help but admire the two-us look her hair had. She was just so beautiful. My heart squeezed as I braced myself for what was to come next. "Okay, Angel. Okay, let's stop." I nodded, pulling back to give her space. Her legs were crossed, and I leaned back on the headboard, crossing my arms, sitting perpendicular to her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelgan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. "Max," she said, horrible things about why you. She started. I noticed the weight ears welled in her eyes. Her gaze fell to her hands, which were fiddling with the hem of her shirt. "I need to hear from you what happened," she whispered. "Okay." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelgan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. "Oh, okay," she asked, looking up at me in slight surprise. She seemed to have expected I would avoid the topic. And in honesty, a part of me wanted to. However, I couldn't leave her in the dark any longer. I loved her too much for that. And I wanted to tell her. But if she said it back, I wanted her to love me, the real me. If she didn't know who I was taking away the chance for her to do that. I took a deep breath and then looked into her eyes. They were chasms of a warm summer's day, and I felt them release the tension in my shoulders. A calm pouring over me. When I was born, I began. My mother died in childbirth. Losing a mate drives most wolves to insanity. It's supposed to be the equivalent of half of your entire being dying, draining you of power. Most mates die of despair. I looked at Evelyn, trying to gauge her reaction. Her eyes had softened ever so slightly, but her face remained stoic. It was a silent reminder of her internal strength. But my father, he was too stubborn to die. He decided that leading his pack was more important, so he found someone to fill in my mother's place. My eyes dark and a bit at the thought. "Why, you can do that?" Evelyn stuttered. I realized the implication of my words as my eyes wide, and I uncurled my arms to grab her hand. "You can, but it's incredibly rare. Only documented a few times in our history." I looked into her eyes and lifted a hand to caress her cheek, speaking lowly. "And I would never want another person besides you." She blushed and gave me a slight nod, beckoning me to continue the story. I pulled back from her, knowing that the next part would make me angry. I didn't want to touch her in case my claws came out. My father, he never was able to fully love me because of my mother's passing. He wasn't cruel. He was just detached. But the women, she made him happy for a few years. I spoke blandly, remembering a small period of time when my stepmother had treated me with kindness. But then my little brother was born. Memories flooded of a sweet chubby-faced boy with red hair and tanned skin. My best friend. Someone who always loved me and never held my past against me. Your brother? Evelyn asked with furrowed brows. Yes, my brother. I smiled softly. He was my best friend. His name was Charlie and he loved everyone and everything. He would carry spiders out of the house and relocate frogs. I let put a dry laugh. He even loved dogs, which most werewolves hate. I looked intently at Evelyn. He was my world. But then something happened. I trailed off and looked towards the wall. I'm sure she told you I was a monster. That I killed my brother. Evelyn gulped and one glance in her direction confirmed that was the case. I chuckled darkly, a tear slipping down my face. No one believed me about what happened that day. Not even my own father. I burrowed my face into my chest, my hands caging my head. The echoes of the past seemed to haunt me. I let out a silent sob, and was shocked when small arms wrapped around me, and my hair was smoothed back with gentle hands. Maximus, Evelyn asked me in a tender voice. What happened? Shakily, I looked up at her, my lip quivering. I was 12 years old. Charlie was only 7. I bit out. We were playing hide and seek in the forest. I found Charlie in a clearing and was confused. He was always a very good hider. Evelyn squeezed my shoulder in reassurance. He looked like he had seen a ghost. His entire body was shaking. I called to him and then he screamed my name. It was only then that I saw the wolf. It moved so fast Evelyn eyed. I began to sob and Evelyn held me in her arms, choosing me. She crawled into my lap. Then, she wrapped her arms around my neck, allowing me to bury my head in her chest and hug her tightly against me. There was blood. So much blood. I didn't make it in time. I was too young to shift. When they found me, there was no trace of a rogue. No scent in the air. Nothing. Absolutely nothing but my blood, soaked body and my little brother lying limp condemned, mangled in arms. I sobbed and she held me. She held me. In all my life, no one had ever held me before. No one wanted to touch me, let alone hold me. No one wanted to comfort me. And here she was, hearing the truth and still not thinking of me as a monster. But I still hadn't told her the rest of it. Evelyn, I spoke shakily, pulling away from her. Her brows pulled in concern and she wiped the tears flowing down my face with her thumbs. Yes, Max. She asked me in concern. There's one more thing. Okay. She nodded, bracing herself. After the incident, my stepmother she. I thought of how to explain and struck me. I gently picked Evelyn up by the waist and moved her off me, before crawling off my bed and standing in front of Evelyn. I took another deep breath. What you are about to see, Evelyn, no one knows about. Or at least no one knows how I got them. She moved towards the edge of the bed, sitting on her knees. That what? I pulled my shirt over my head and Evelyn gasped. I looked at her face and saw nothing but pure horror painted over it. I had gotten so used to the marks. I forgot how they appeared to others. Jagged lines marred my entire chest. But that wasn't even the beginning of it. I turned around and Evelyn sobbed behind me at the sight. My entire back was covered in deep raised gashes. Years of silver chains beating into my back, caraming the skin, leaving their mark. I heard the bed dip. Her feet patted again the ground and approached behind me. Oh, Max, she cried. See, could I? I nodded my head. Her soft warm hands gently traced a scar and I felt her fingers tremble. I turned around, looking at her red puffy face as tears flowed down my own face. She wrapped her arms around my neck. This is why you killed her, she whispered. No, I whispered, and she pulled back and looked into my eyes. I killed her because she finally tried to kill me. Evelyn let out a strangled sob, grabbing me again, but this time tighter. Her hold on me was impregnable, and she sobbed into my shoulder. I picked her up and she wrapped her legs around my torso, our bodies melding together. I sat down on the bed. After a few moments, her cries died down, and she pulled away from me. This was it. She was going to reject me. She was going to tell me I was a monster. Max, yes. I gulped. My entire form shook. I love you, she whispered. Why you? I stuttered. Tu es agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nogan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I breathed. I love you with my entire being, Maximus Alexander. You are caring. Her voice cracked and she wiped a tear trailing down her face. And you are compassionate. She smiled. You are kind and gentle. You are not a monster. You have become everything to me and I love you, she confessed. My wolf howled within and elation took over my being in full force. I grabbed her head, intertwining my fingers in her hair and putting her in. I hungrily pressed my lips against hers, devouring her mouth. Our tongues entangled themselves in a battle as she allowed me to win entrance to her mouth. I pressed her body against mine, not able to get enough of her, pulling away, out of breath. I pressed our foreheads together. I love you too, Evelyn, I whispered. I love you so much. Every fiber of my being lives for you. I want nothing more than to protect you, to cherish you for the rest of my life. You are my everything. She smiled widely at me, tears streaming down her face as pressed our lips together. Working my way from her mouth, I pressed a stream of kisses down from her face to neck, finding the sweet spot on her collarbone. Her hands tightened around my neck and she groaned. Evelyn, I whispered against her skin hum. Can I make you mine? She pulled back slightly, and I felt myself grow disappointed. Maximus. She trailed off. I already am yours, she whispered. That was all it took. My restraint fled as I once again peppered kiss down her neck into the crook. My teeth elongated and I brushed them against the spot, making her entire form shiver. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry, I whispered, before sinking my teeth into her neck. She screamed as I clapped down harder, rubbing gentle circles on her back. Her hands gripped my shoulders tightly, nails digging into the skin. I tightened my grip before releasing my teeth slowly and licking the wound. Made saliva help soothe and heal wounds faster. Evelyn instantly went limp against me, falling asleep in my arms. Wrapping my arms around her waist, I laid down beside her and pulled her into my chest. My body released a hum. For the first time in my life, I knew I would sleep entirely at peace. My mate was safe and tucked away in my arms,